In the summer of 1916, the fields along the River Somme in northern France were green, quiet, and peaceful. Farmers had worked that land for generations. Small villages stood between narrow roads lined with trees, and church bells echoed through the countryside every morning. But within a few months, the earth itself would be ripped apart so violently that many soldiers later said it looked like the surface of another planet. The First World War changed Europe forever. When the war began in 1914, many young men believed it would be over by Christmas. Politicians promised glory. Newspapers spoke about honor and patriotism. Across Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, millions volunteered for military service. Few understood what modern industrial warfare would truly become. Machine guns changed everything. Before World War I, European armies were still influenced by the tactics of the 19th century. Officers believed courage and discipline could overcome enemy fire. Cavalry charges were still part of military doctrine. Infantry often advanced in large formations across open fields, but technology had evolved faster than military thinking. The machine gun, rapid-fire artillery, barbed wire, and modern rifles turned the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on the first day alone. Entire units disappeared within hours. Soldiers climbed out of trenches carrying heavy packs, expecting to walk across damaged German lines after days of artillery bombardment. Instead, German machine gunners emerged from deep concrete bunkers and opened fire. One British officer later wrote that the men fell like rows of cut wheat. The war soon became trapped underground. From the English Channel to Switzerland, both sides dug thousands of miles of trenches. Mud, rats, disease, artillery fire, and constant fear became part of daily life. In some areas, soldiers lived only a few dozen meters away from the enemy for months or even years. Attacking across open ground usually meant death. Defending was easier than advancing. European military leaders learned a terrible lesson during those years. Frontal assaults against prepared defenses could destroy entire armies. France suffered especially badly. Nearly every French family lost someone during the war. Entire towns lost a generation of young men. By 1918, over 1 million French soldiers had been killed. The psychological scars remained long after the guns went silent. That trauma shaped French military thinking during the years between the wars. French commanders became obsessed with defense. They believed the next war must never become another bloodbath like Verdun or the Somme. So France invested enormous resources into fortifications. Massive underground bunkers, artillery positions, rail systems, and reinforced concrete defenses were built along the German border. This became known as the Maginot Line. To French leaders, it was not cowardice, it was survival. Germany learned different lessons. German officers studied the failures of trench warfare and concluded that speed, surprise, and decentralized leadership were the future of combat. During the final years of World War I, specially trained German stormtroopers began using infiltration tactics. Instead of attacking the strongest enemy positions directly, they bypassed them, moving quickly through weak points and causing chaos behind enemy lines. Young German officers who survived the trenches carried those ideas into the next generation. Men like Heinz Guderian argued that tanks, radios, aircraft, and mobile infantry should work together as one fast-moving force. Germany could not afford another long war of attrition. It needed quick victories. Meanwhile, Britain remained cautious. British commanders had seen too many offensives fail during World War I. They valued careful planning, artillery preparation, and controlled advances. British infantry doctrine emphasized coordination and discipline over rapid improvisation. Every movement on the battlefield was measured against the memory of trench warfare disasters. And then there was the United States. America entered World War I late in 1917. Although American troops fought bravely during the final year of the war, the United States did not experience the same level of destruction as Europe. Its cities were untouched. Its farmland remained intact. No enemy armies marched through American towns. The war was terrible for American soldiers, but it did not scar the entire nation the way it scarred Europe. That difference mattered enormously. When American officers studied the First World War afterward, they focused less on trauma and more on mobility, production, and technology. The United States possessed vast industrial capacity, enormous natural resources, and geographic security provided by two oceans. American military planners believed future wars could be won through movement, firepower, logistics, and machines rather than endless attrition. During the interwar years, American thinkers became fascinated with mechanization. Trucks replaced horses, radios improved communication, tanks evolved rapidly, aircraft became faster and deadlier every year. While European armies worried about surviving another Verdun, many American officers imagined a different kind of battlefield entirely, one dominated by speed and industrial power. Still, no one fully understood what the next war would look like. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Europe once again descended into chaos. German armored columns smashed through enemy lines with shocking speed. Aircraft attacked roads, railways, and communication centers. Infantry advanced alongside tanks instead of slowly behind artillery barrages. The world called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. France collapsed in only 6 weeks. For many observers, it seemed as though Germany had solved the deadly stalemate of World War I, but in reality, every army entering World War II still carried the ghosts of the trenches with them. French commanders feared another massacre. British leaders feared reckless offensives. German officers feared becoming trapped in another long industrial war they could not sustain. And the Americans? They prepared to fight differently from all of them. The United States Army expanded rapidly after 1941, but it entered the war with unique advantages. American factories produced unimaginable quantities of trucks, radios, ammunition, fuel, tanks, and aircraft. American infantry divisions became highly mobile compared to many European armies. Instead of relying solely on manpower, the U.S. military relied on overwhelming firepower and constant supply. American soldiers would still face horror in North Africa, Italy, Normandy, and the forests of Germany. Thousands would die, but the philosophy behind their battlefield advances would differ from the exhausted traditions of Europe. Because unlike the old powers of Europe, America had not spent 4 years buried in the mud of the Western Front. And that difference would shape the way its infantry fought throughout the Second World War. By the winter of 1944, the forests of Belgium were frozen solid. Snow covered abandoned villages, broken roads, and burned-out vehicles. American soldiers moved carefully through the Ardennes, exhausted from weeks of fighting. Somewhere beyond the trees, hidden German artillery waited in silence. Then the shelling began. Veterans later said the earth itself seemed to explode beneath them. Entire sections of forest vanished under fire. Branches shattered into deadly splinters. Men dropped into foxholes as artillery rounds crashed through the snow-covered woods. It was the opening phase of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final major offensive in the West. But within hours, the American response revealed something unique about the U.S. Army during the Second World War. Instead of answering German manpower with equal manpower, the Americans answered with firepower. Again and again throughout World War II, the United States relied not on massive waves of infantry, but on overwhelming artillery, mechanized logistics, air support, and industrial strength. American commanders believed that machines and firepower could save lives. Every shell fired by artillery meant fewer infantrymen dying in direct assaults. This philosophy separated the United States from many European armies. In the forests near Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery units worked almost non-stop. Forward observers hidden near the front radioed coordinates back to batteries miles away. Within minutes, dozens of guns could concentrate fire on a single target. Shells screamed through the sky day and night. German survivors later described American artillery as terrifyingly accurate and unbelievably fast. One German officer called it the Steel Rain. The US Army had built an artillery system unlike anything else in the war. American divisions possessed enormous numbers of trucks, radios, ammunition carriers, and communication networks. Radios allowed infantry officers to contact artillery support almost instantly. Instead of waiting hours for approval through rigid chains of command, American units could react quickly to changing battlefield conditions. Technology made the difference. In many European armies, communication often depended on field telephones, runners, motorcycles, or written orders, but the Americans embraced radio communication on a massive scale. Tanks carried radios, jeeps carried radios. Infantry platoons often coordinated directly with artillery batteries and aircraft. That level of coordination transformed how American infantry advanced. A German machine gun nest blocking an American platoon was rarely attacked immediately with bayonets or massed infantry assaults. Instead, American commanders usually called for mortar fire, artillery support, tanks, or fighter bombers. Firepower became the first solution. This approach was expensive, but America could afford it. The United States possessed the largest industrial economy in the world. American factories operated day and night producing trucks, tanks, aircraft, radios, ammunition, and fuel. In Detroit, automobile factories transformed into military production centers. At the Ford Willow Run plant, B-24 bombers rolled off assembly lines at astonishing speed. Shipyards launched cargo ships faster than German submarines could sink them. American logistics became a weapon itself. During the war, the US Army moved millions of tons of supplies across oceans and continents. Fuel pipelines crossed France after the Normandy invasion. Endless convoys of trucks delivered ammunition directly to frontline units. American soldiers often joked that their army could deliver hot coffee and ice cream almost anywhere on Earth. Behind the humor was an important truth: mobility depended on supply. European armies often relied heavily on railroads or horses for transport. Germany, despite its image as a mechanized military power, still used hundreds of thousands of horses during the war. Mud, destroyed roads, and fuel shortages constantly limited German movement. The Americans operated differently. Large numbers of trucks allowed US infantry divisions to move rapidly across huge distances. Entire formations could relocate quickly when needed. Supplies followed them constantly. Mechanization reduced dependence on railroads and increased operational flexibility. This became especially important after the Normandy landings in 1944. Once Allied forces broke through German lines in France, American armored and infantry divisions advanced rapidly across the countryside, but fast offensives created new problems. Tanks consumed enormous amounts of fuel. Artillery required huge quantities of ammunition. Soldiers needed food, medicine, spare parts, winter clothing, and fuel every single day. The Red Ball Express was created to solve the crisis. Thousands of American truck drivers, many of them African-American soldiers serving in segregated units, operated almost continuously along dangerous supply routes through France. Day and night, convoys carried gasoline, ammunition, and equipment toward the front lines. Drivers often slept only a few hours before returning to the road again. Without those convoys, the American advance would have stopped. General George Patton himself once admitted that modern armies moved on fuel as much as courage. A tank without gasoline became useless metal. Artillery without shells became silent. American planners understood this deeply. Logistics was not secondary to combat, it was combat. Air power also became central to American battlefield doctrine. By 1944, Allied aircraft dominated much of the sky over Western Europe. Fighter bombers attacked German convoys, railways, bridges, and defensive positions. American infantry units frequently operated knowing that air support could arrive when needed. This created enormous psychological pressure on German forces, who often feared Allied aircraft even more than artillery. The integration between ground forces and aircraft became increasingly sophisticated during the war. Forward air controllers sometimes moved close to the front lines, communicating directly with pilots overhead. A hidden German position discovered by infantry could suddenly face bombs and rockets within minutes. Few armies in history had achieved that level of battlefield coordination. But American reliance on firepower also had weaknesses. Artillery and air attacks could devastate enemy defenses, but they could not always replace infantry completely. In dense forests, mountains, cities, and bad weather, American soldiers still had to advance on foot under enemy fire. Battles like Huichin Forest revealed the limits of technology. Their difficult terrain reduced the effectiveness of tanks and aircraft, forcing brutal close combat against experienced German defenders. Casualties rose sharply. Even so, American commanders continued prioritizing firepower whenever possible. Their goal was simple: reduce infantry losses through overwhelming support weapons. The U.S. Army understood that trained soldiers were difficult to replace, even for a nation with vast resources. This philosophy contrasted sharply with the Soviet Union. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces often accepted enormous casualties during offensives against German positions. Soviet strategy relied heavily on mass assaults, operational depth, and relentless pressure. The Red Army achieved extraordinary victories, but at horrifying human cost. The Americans sought a different balance. They preferred shells over bodies, trucks over horses, radios over rigid command systems, machines over manpower whenever possible. By the final months of the war, this system overwhelmed Nazi Germany. American infantry divisions advanced behind rolling artillery barrages, supported by tanks, aircraft, engineers, and endless supply columns. It was not simply courage that pushed the U.S. Army across Europe. It was industrialized warfare on a scale the world had never seen before. And for American soldiers advancing through France, Belgium, and Germany, firepower often became the difference between survival and death. In the early morning darkness of June 22, 1941, more than 3 million German soldiers stood waiting along the Soviet border. Engines rumbled quietly in the distance. Horses pulled artillery through muddy roads. Infantry units checked rifles and machine guns one last time. Then, without warning, the largest land invasion in human history began. Operation Barbarossa had started. German artillery exploded across hundreds of miles of frontier. Aircraft roared overhead, destroying Soviet airfields before many pilots could even take off. Armored columns smashed through border defenses at terrifying speed. Entire Soviet divisions were surrounded within days. To the world, it looked unstoppable. But behind Germany's rapid victories stood a very different style of infantry warfare than the methods used by Britain, France, or the Soviet Union. During World War II, every major European army fought according to its own military culture, shaped by geography, history, resources, and painful experience from the First World War. No two armies advanced in exactly the same way. The German army entered the war with one of the most flexible tactical systems in Europe. German officers believed that lower-ranking commanders should make decisions independently when battlefield conditions changed. This concept became known as Auftragstaktik, mission command. Instead of waiting for detailed instructions from headquarters, German officers were expected to understand the overall objective and adapt freely to achieve it. This created speed. A German platoon leader encountering resistance did not always stop and request permission from higher command. He might immediately maneuver around enemy positions, coordinate machine gun fire, or exploit weak points on his own initiative. German infantry training emphasized aggression, movement, and decentralized action. Their squads were also built differently. Unlike American squads, which centered around riflemen, German infantry tactics revolved around the machine gun. The MG-34 and later the MG-42 became the heart of the squad. German riflemen often existed primarily to support the machine gun team, and those weapons were devastating. The MG-42 fired so rapidly that Allied soldiers described it as sounding like tearing fabric or a buzzsaw. In defensive battles, German machine guns could pin down entire enemy platoons. This gave German infantry units enormous firepower at the tactical level. But Germany had weaknesses too. Despite its reputation for mechanization, much of the German army still depended heavily on horses and railroads. Fuel shortages constantly limited mobility. German industry struggled to replace losses during long campaigns. And as the war continued, experienced German soldiers became increasingly difficult to replace. Meanwhile, far to the east, the Soviet Union fought a completely different war. The Eastern Front became the deadliest battlefield in history. Entire cities were destroyed. Millions of soldiers and civilians died. Soviet commanders often faced impossible choices under brutal conditions. In 1942, during the Battle of Stalingrad, Soviet infantry units crossed the Volga River under constant German artillery and air attack. Many soldiers arrived on the western bank, already exhausted, terrified, and surrounded by ruins. Buildings became fortresses. Factories became battlefields. Combat sometimes occurred room by room, floor by floor. Soviet tactics relied heavily on mass, endurance, and relentless pressure. The Red Army suffered catastrophic losses during the first years of the war, but Soviet industry evacuated eastward beyond the Ural Mountains and continued producing tanks, artillery, and ammunition in enormous quantities. Soviet commanders understood that Germany could not sustain endless attrition forever. So they attacked repeatedly. Soviet offensives often used massive artillery bombardments followed by waves of infantry and armored forces pushing deep into enemy lines. The concept of deep battle aimed not only to break the front line, but to destroy enemy operational reserves far behind it. The cost was horrifying. During major offensives like Operation Bagration in 1944, Soviet forces achieved extraordinary victories against Germany, but casualties remained enormous. Soviet commanders frequently accepted losses that Western armies considered unacceptable. Survival of the state took priority over individual lives. Discipline inside the Red Army could also be extremely harsh. Blocking detachments sometimes prevented retreat. Political officers monitored loyalty. Fear became part of the battlefield environment. Yet despite these brutal realities, Soviet soldiers demonstrated extraordinary resilience under conditions few armies could endure. Then there was Britain. British infantry doctrine during World War II reflected caution learned from the disasters of the First World War. British commanders generally preferred carefully planned operations supported by artillery rather than reckless offensives. Coordination mattered deeply. British infantry advances were often methodical and deliberate. Commanders emphasized maintaining organized lines, preserving communication, and avoiding unnecessary casualties. During campaigns in North Africa and Italy, British forces frequently relied on artillery preparation before attacks. But critics sometimes argued that British operations lacked flexibility compared to German tactics. German units occasionally reacted faster to battlefield changes because junior officers possessed greater freedom of action. British command structures could be more rigid, especially early in the war. Orders often moved through formal channels before action was taken. Still, British soldiers adapted over time. By 1944, British and Commonwealth forces had become highly experienced in combined arms warfare. Tanks, artillery, infantry, and aircraft increasingly worked together effectively, particularly after years of hard fighting across multiple theaters. France, however, experienced perhaps the greatest military shock of all. Before World War II, France possessed one of the largest armies in Europe. French soldiers were brave and experienced, but French military doctrine remained heavily influenced by the trauma of World War I. French commanders feared another catastrophic war of attrition. As a result, French strategy emphasized defense, fortified positions, and controlled operations rather than rapid maneuver warfare. The Maginot Line symbolized this mindset, a massive defensive barrier designed to stop another German invasion. But in 1940, German armored forces bypassed much of the line through the Ardennes forest, an area many French planners considered unsuitable for large-scale attacks. The collapse happened with shocking speed. French units often fought hard locally, but communication failures, slow decision-making, and rapid German maneuver created chaos. German commanders exploited gaps faster than French headquarters could react. Entire formations became isolated or surrounded. The fall of France changed the world. It also demonstrated how differently European armies approached infantry warfare. Germany emphasized speed, initiative, and tactical aggression. The Soviet Union relied on mass, endurance, and operational depth. Britain preferred organized coordination and artillery-supported advances. France focused heavily on defense and controlled battle management. Each system reflected the fears and experiences of its nation. And then there were the Americans. Watching from across the Atlantic early in the war, U.S. military planners studied all these methods carefully. They observed German maneuver tactics, Soviet large-scale offensives, British coordination systems, and French defensive failures. But America would not copy any single European model completely. Instead, the United States built its own approach, one centered on mobility, communication, logistics, mechanization, and overwhelming firepower. American infantry would advance differently because America itself was different, richer, safer geographically, and powered by industrial production on an unmatched scale. As the war expanded across Europe, those differences would become increasingly visible on every battlefield from Normandy to Berlin. And by the final year of the war, the contrast between American infantry doctrine and the exhausted armies of Europe would reshape modern warfare forever. On June 6, 1944, before dawn broke over the coast of Normandy, thousands of American soldiers sat silently inside landing craft crossing the English Channel. The sea was rough. Many men were seasick. Others stared into darkness, gripping rifles with trembling hands. Some prayed quietly. Some smoked cigarettes in silence. Most were barely older than 20. Ahead of them waited Nazi-occupied France. As the first waves approached Omaha Beach, German machine guns opened fire from fortified cliffs overlooking the shoreline. Mortars exploded in the surf. Landing craft shattered under artillery hits. Men carrying heavy equipment drowned before reaching the sand. Entire squads disappeared within seconds. For many soldiers, the invasion felt like chaos. Yet even during those terrifying first hours of D-Day, the American way of battle began to reveal itself. U.S. infantry did not fight alone. Every movement depended on coordination between infantry, artillery, engineers, tanks, naval guns, aircraft, and radio communication. American doctrine focused on combined arms warfare, multiple branches of the military working together as one system. That system became America's greatest strength during World War II. At Omaha Beach, infantry alone could not break German defenses. Engineers struggled to clear obstacles under fire. Tanks sank in rough water before reaching shore, but naval artillery from offshore warships bombarded German positions continuously. Destroyers moved dangerously close to the coastline, firing directly into bunkers from short range. Meanwhile, small groups of American soldiers began climbing the cliffs independently. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers played a crucial role in this process. American doctrine encouraged initiative at lower levels. If a lieutenant was killed, sergeants often took command immediately. Small units adapted to battlefield conditions without waiting for detailed orders from distant headquarters. This flexibility mattered enormously. German defenses at Omaha were strong precisely because they disrupted organized assaults. Large formations became impossible to control under heavy fire. Survival often depended on individual squads improvising their way forward through smoke, explosions, and confusion. By the end of the day, American forces had secured the beachhead. The cost was severe, but the invasion succeeded because American infantry operated as part of a larger battlefield network. Tanks, engineers, artillery, aircraft, naval guns, and logistics all supported the advance. No single branch won the battle alone. That became the foundation of the American way of war. As Allied forces pushed inland through France, American infantry faced new challenges. The Norman countryside was divided by ancient hedgerows, thick walls of earth and vegetation separating narrow fields. German defenders turned this terrain into a deadly maze of ambushes and machine gun positions. Tanks struggled to move through the hedgerows safely. Infantry advancing alone became vulnerable to hidden fire. Progress slowed dramatically. So American units adapted. Engineers welded steel prongs onto Sherman tanks, allowing them to break through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. Infantry coordinated closely with armor, moving together field by field. Artillery observers followed advancing units, calling in fire support whenever resistance appeared. This was not blind aggression, it was systematic battlefield coordination. American infantry squads themselves reflected this philosophy. Unlike German squads built around machine guns, American squads emphasized balance and flexibility. Soldiers carried semi-automatic M1 Garand rifles, giving them a higher rate of fire than many enemy troops armed with bolt-action rifles. General George Patton famously called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. Fire and maneuver became central to American infantry tactics. One group of soldiers pinned enemy positions with rifle and machine gun fire, while another maneuvered around the flank. Mortars supported advances at short range. Tanks attacked strongpoints directly. Radios connected units across constantly changing battlefields. Communication was everything. American officers relied heavily on radio networks to coordinate movement. Requests for artillery support could move rapidly through command channels. Air support became increasingly integrated into frontline operations. This gave American infantry remarkable battlefield responsiveness compared to many armies of the time. During the breakout from Normandy in Operation Cobra, American forces demonstrated the destructive power of combined arms warfare fully. Heavy bombers attacked German defensive positions before the ground assault began. Artillery saturation followed. Then armored divisions punched through weakened lines while infantry advanced behind them. Once German defenses cracked, American mechanized forces exploited the breakthrough rapidly across France. Speed now became a weapon. Truck-mounted infantry, tanks, engineers, reconnaissance units, and supply convoys moved together across huge distances. German commanders often struggled to establish stable defensive lines because American forces advanced faster than expected. But the American system was not perfect. In difficult terrain like the Huachen forest near the German border, technology and mobility became less effective. Dense woods restricted tanks and reduced visibility. Artillery explosions shattered trees into deadly wooden fragments. German defenders used prepared positions effectively. American infantry suffered heavy casualties there. The battle revealed an important truth. Even the most advanced battlefield system still depended on soldiers moving forward on foot under fire. Technology could support infantry, but it could not completely replace human endurance and courage. Still, American adaptability remained one of its greatest strengths. When facing urban combat, American forces developed new coordination methods between tanks and infantry. In river crossings, engineers rapidly constructed bridges under enemy fire. Medical evacuation systems improved survival rates for wounded soldiers compared to previous wars. The U.S. Army continuously adjusted its tactics based on battlefield experience. One major advantage came from the American non-commissioned officer corps. Sergeants often exercised significant leadership responsibility during combat. In chaotic situations, small unit leaders made independent decisions quickly. This decentralized flexibility helped American forces maintain momentum even when operations became disorganized. German veterans later acknowledged this strength. Many noted that American units recovered quickly from setbacks. If one attack failed, artillery and reinforcements usually followed rapidly. If roads were destroyed, engineers repaired them. If tanks were lost, replacements arrived. The sheer logistical depth behind American infantry became impossible to ignore. By 1945, as Allied armies crossed into Germany itself, the American method of battle had reached full maturity. Infantry divisions advanced with massive artillery support, close air coordination, mechanized transport, engineering assistance, and reliable communication systems. Unlike many exhausted European armies, the United States could sustain this enormous operational machine continuously. The result was a style of warfare built not around sacrificing vast numbers of soldiers, but around maximizing coordination, mobility, and firepower. The American infantryman still faced bullets, artillery, mud, fear, and death like every soldier before him, but he rarely fought alone. Behind him stood an entire industrial nation. Factories, railroads, fuel depots, truck convoys, radio operators, artillery batteries, engineers, aircraft, and millions of workers supporting every advance. That was the true American way of battle during World War II. Not simply bravery, but the ability to combine technology, logistics, leadership, and firepower into one unstoppable battlefield system. In March 1945, American soldiers stood on the western bank of the Rhine River, staring into the heart of Nazi Germany. For years, German propaganda had described the Rhine as an unconquerable barrier, the final shield protecting the Reich from invasion. Bridges had been destroyed across much of the river. German commanders believed the crossing would delay the Allies for weeks, perhaps even months. Then something unexpected happened. Near the town of Remagen, soldiers from the U.S. 9th Armored Division discovered that one bridge still remained standing. The Ludendorff Bridge was damaged, wired with explosives, and partially collapsing under artillery fire, but it had not fallen. German engineers had attempted to destroy it, yet somehow the charges failed to bring the entire structure down. Smoke filled the air as American troops realized what stood before them, a direct path into Germany itself. Without waiting for perfect conditions, they moved immediately. Infantrymen sprinted across the bridge, while German machine guns and artillery opened fire. Engineers desperately cut demolition wires, while chunks of steel and concrete crashed into the river below. At any second, the bridge could collapse completely. But the Americans kept advancing. Within hours, thousands of troops crossed the Rhine. Tanks, artillery, engineers, and supply units soon followed. What Germany hoped would become a long defensive struggle instead turned into another rapid Allied breakthrough. The capture of the bridge at Remagen symbolized something larger than a single tactical victory. It revealed why the American system of warfare had become so powerful by the final year of World War II. The United States did not win through infantry courage alone. Every major army possessed brave soldiers. German troops fought stubbornly even in defeat. Soviet soldiers endured unimaginable suffering on the Eastern Front. British and Commonwealth forces battled across Africa, Italy, and Western Europe for years. What made the American system different was its ability to combine industrial power, logistics, communication, mobility, leadership, and firepower into one coordinated machine. And by 1945, that machine was overwhelming Nazi Germany from every direction. American logistics became one of the greatest military achievements in history. Behind every advancing infantry division stood endless networks of supply. Fuel trucks crossed Europe continuously. Engineers rebuilt roads and bridges almost as quickly as they were destroyed. Portable pipelines pumped gasoline toward the front. Cargo ships carried mountains of food, ammunition, vehicles, medicine, and spare parts across the Atlantic Ocean every day. German commanders increasingly understood an uncomfortable truth. They could destroy individual American units, but they could not destroy the industrial system supporting them. When American tanks were knocked out, replacements arrived. When artillery batteries exhausted ammunition, more shells followed. When bridges collapsed, engineers rebuilt them. The U.S. Army possessed a level of operational endurance few nations could match. This endurance protected American infantry in ways that were sometimes invisible. A wounded American soldier in 1945 had a far greater chance of survival than soldiers in many earlier wars. Medical evacuation systems improved dramatically during World War II. Jeeps, ambulances, field hospitals, blood plasma, antibiotics like penicillin, and organized evacuation routes saved thousands of lives. American commanders increasingly viewed manpower as valuable and difficult to replace. That philosophy influenced battlefield tactics directly. Instead of relying primarily on massive infantry assaults, the United States preferred artillery bombardments, mechanized maneuver, and overwhelming support weapons whenever possible. Firepower reduced casualties. Logistics sustained momentum. Technology amplified combat effectiveness. The German army, by contrast, slowly collapsed under pressure it could no longer sustain. By late 1944, Germany faced catastrophic shortages of fuel, trained manpower, vehicles, and aircraft. Allied bombing campaigns crippled industrial production and transportation networks. Experienced German veterans died faster than they could be replaced. Young recruits and elderly reservists increasingly filled the ranks. Yet German units often remained tactically dangerous. Even during the final months of the war, American forces sometimes encountered fierce resistance from isolated German defenders. Battles in places like Aachen and the Huichen Forest proved that experienced infantry in defensive terrain could still inflict serious casualties. But Germany could no longer fight a modern industrial war successfully. The United States could replace losses faster. It could transport resources farther. It could coordinate large-scale operations more efficiently. It could maintain air superiority, artillery dominance, and mechanized mobility simultaneously across multiple fronts. This was industrialized warfare at its highest level. The Soviet Union also played a decisive role in defeating Germany, especially on the Eastern Front, where the majority of German forces were destroyed. Soviet armies absorbed enormous losses while pushing relentlessly westward toward Berlin. But the Soviet method depended heavily on sacrifice. Entire Soviet offensives sometimes consumed staggering numbers of lives. Villages, cities, and infrastructure across Eastern Europe were devastated by years of brutal combat. The Red Army achieved victory through resilience, mass mobilization, and operational scale unlike anything the world had seen. The American system aimed for something different. The United States tried to maximize battlefield efficiency while minimizing unnecessary losses. Not because war became humane, it never did, but because American doctrine emphasized preserving combat effectiveness over time. A living, experienced soldier remained more valuable than a dead hero. This thinking would later shape modern NATO military doctrine after the war. Communication also gave the Americans enormous advantages. Radios connected infantry, tanks, artillery, aircraft, engineers, and headquarters with remarkable speed. Battlefield information moved faster than in many other armies. Decisions adapted more rapidly to changing conditions. American commanders often coordinated operations across huge distances while maintaining flexibility at lower levels. Small unit leadership became another hidden strength. American sergeants and junior officers frequently exercised independent judgment during combat. If plans failed, units improvised. If resistance appeared unexpectedly, artillery or air support could often be redirected quickly. The system encouraged adaptation instead of rigid obedience. By April 1945, Allied armies were advancing deep into Germany from the west, while Soviet forces closed in from the east. German cities burned under bombardment. Refugees crowded roads across the collapsing Reich. Fuel shortages immobilized remaining armored units. Communications disintegrated. Entire German formations surrendered without ammunition, transportation, or hope of reinforcement. And still, the American advance continued. Truck convoys rolled through shattered towns. Engineers repaired bridges overnight. Artillery batteries displaced forward constantly. Fighter aircraft patrolled overhead. Infantry divisions advanced with overwhelming logistical support behind them. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. For millions, the victory felt almost unbelievable after years of destruction and death. Cities across Europe lay in ruins. Entire generations had been scarred forever, but from those ruins emerged a new understanding of warfare. World War II proved that modern battle was no longer decided only by bravery or battlefield tactics alone. It was decided by systems, by industry, by logistics, by communication, by mobility, by coordination between machines, soldiers, factories, engineers, fuel, transportation, and leadership. And no nation mastered that system more effectively during the war than the United States. American infantry still bled in Normandy, the Ardennes, Italy, and Germany. Thousands never returned home, but unlike the exhausted armies of Europe, the United States fought with the support of an industrial and logistical network operating on a global scale. That was the true reason the American system advanced differently during World War II. And ultimately, why it won.